By the way, you know I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun. And the kid used to come up, reach in the pool, and rub my leg down, so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. They look at it. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I love kids jumping on my lap.
Action News Network is an Aboriginal American media network. As such, we are protected under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or DRIP, Articles 8, 14, and 16. Action News Network is allowed to provide Aboriginal news and media content on non-Indigenous media platforms free of oppressive censorship. Any breach of this protection is a breach of international law.
Right, so if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black, and you ain't black,
and you ain't black.
And you may find yourself living in a shotgun shack, and you may find yourself in another part of the world, and you may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile, and you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground. And you may ask yourself, how do I work this?
Joseph Biden. What can I say about Joe that he having dry snitched on himself already? Politically, Joe's the gift that keeps on giving, known as a gaffe machine. The man suffers from a big mouth and a scrappy spirit. Joe once was the young bad boy of the Senate, among the youngest ever elected at like 30 years old in the early 70s, which of course is like 50 years ago now. Joe's from Delaware, the smallest state by size along with Rhode Island. On the I-95, if it wasn't for a big-ass bridge crossing the Delaware Bay and a few tolls in a remarkably short distance. One for the Delaware Turnpike, which is a stretch of a name for a segment that lasts about 20 minutes of your life. If not for these money traps, you would pass by not even knowing you've been through the state. Delaware is typical of mid-Atlantic states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. It's industrialized, the cities are old and run down, and it's pretty blue. Wilmington is the largest city, with a little over 250,000 people. Not the biggest city, it's about 30 minutes from Philly, almost making it a suburb of Philly. You can commute to Philly easily and back for work. It looks like a Philly junior. The same row house design, track housing, typical of most mid-Atlantic cities like Baltimore and New York. But due to having almost no business tax, Wilmington is a business mecca, with almost all banks in the U.S. naming Wilmington or Delaware in general as their headquarters, along with like a million other businesses, as long as they list a property in that state as their address. Delaware sided with the North during the Civil War, despite being a slave state. The same for Maryland and sister state. Segregation was a fixture in both of these states, despite being considered northern and industrialized. This would no doubt play a role in Joe Biden's upbringing in the 50s, as well as we'll discover shortly. And his Senate career will show in his decisions and his view of blacks. We also have to remember how different the Democrat Party was in the 60s when Joe Biden started his political career in Wilmington, as the Democrat Party was more out in the open races and conservative than it appears today. Not that much has changed except the illusion, but some of those old whites who have been lifelong Democrats had to change their tone in order to appease the flock of blacks who left the Republican Party 60 years ago, when these so-called liberals was on the wrong side of most liberal issues considered non-negotiable today. Now, another thing about Joe Biden that's funny is all the nicknames he has. Being from New York, you know, I don't trust guys with a lot of nicknames. It's like he's almost a mob guy. So we're gonna.
It don't have
go
nothing to
into
do
his
with Trump.
past
It has to
and
do with the fact I
Dixon.
want something for my community. I would love to see
Take a
you.
look at my record, man. I extended the voting rights 25 years. I have a record that is second to none. The NAACP has endorsed me every time I've run. The world, I mean, come on. Take a look
This
at the
is from the
record.
New York Times. This came out during the primaries. Here's a young Joseph Biden in front of the Capitol in 74. Probably around 30 years old, 32 years old around that time. Well, I could say he's not Sleepy Joe. How Joe Biden became the Democrats' anti-busing crusader. With a school desegregation lawsuit roiling in Delaware in the 1970s, Mr. Biden led an effort in the Senate to end court-ordered busing. Newport, Delaware. In July 1974, with a federal court in Delaware on the verge of ordering busing to integrate Wilmington's overly black public schools, Joseph R. Biden Jr. arrived at a school auditorium in this predominantly white suburb to find himself the target of a political ambush. If you think I'm in trouble with you people, he said then, seeking to assure the crowd that he was on their side, you ought to hear what my liberal friends are telling me. He seems to be separating himself from liberals, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Let's continue. The meeting marked a turning point for the young senator who counted himself a liberal Democrat and an ardent defender of civil rights. Not long after the verbal drubbing, Mr. Biden plunged headfirst into one of the most politically fraught and racially divisive topics in America. He emerged as the Democrats' party's leading anti-busing crusader, a position that puts him in league with Southern segregationists and at odds with liberal Republicans. Now, a lot of y'all today are like, liberal Republicans, it doesn't even make sense. Well, check this out. Back in this is like the early 1970s. At this time, the Republican and Democrat parties were just like open parties, and the liberal and conservative lines kind of were on both sides. Today, you associate liberal with just Democrats and conservatives and Republicans. But back before the mid-70s, I would say, you had both of those ideologies of liberal and the conservative on both parties. And you had more liberals on the Republican side prior to the 1960s and more conservatives on the Democrat side since that same time, right? John F. Kennedy kind of was like one of the first Democrat presidents that was elected overwhelmingly by blacks, who before him, from the 1950s down, mostly voted Republican. So I think politics worked a little bit better back then. It was a little bit more clear cut, because since both parties are kind of open, you had liberal candidates on both sides and conservative candidates on both sides. It kind of seemed like it was a better time for politics then, because both parties had to really fight and scrap it out for the certain vote, right? So let's continue. It helped change the dynamic of the Senate. Even some leaders in his own party, even some leaders in his own party against busing as a desegregation tool. No issue has concerned more of my time and energies, Mr. Biden declared with a flourish as he opened the Senate hearing in 1981, adding, "We want to stop court-ordered busing." So clearly he was against busing, and not only was he against busing, but that issue consumed more of his time and energies. Okay, so he was like really vehement at making sure this busing wouldn't go on. It doesn't really sound like too much of a liberal candidate, a liberal Democrat. And what you gotta understand too, a lot of these older Democrats, like Biden's and your Hillary Clinton, you know, these people been voting since like at least the 1960s. So, and they've been Democrats their whole life. And the Democrats back then were more conservative and more far right. You have both far leftists and far right and on both parties. Now you just kind of like, just like with liberal and conservatives, you kind of assume, you kind of not assume, but you kind of associate left and leftism, the leftists with the Dems, right, and liberals, and you kind of far right is always Republicans now, but you have far right Democrats and far left Democrats, and you have far right Republicans and far left Republicans. Like I said, it was probably a more exciting time in politics. And a lot of those guys, like Strom Thurmond, who was a staunch racist out of, I think, South Carolina, I believe. And I think George Wallace, the guy who said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That dude, I think he was a Democrat too. So just keep that in mind when you go into the polls of who these people were idolizing when they was coming up, and who these people and how these people voted as the parties changed by like the mid 1970s, right? These people didn't change parties; they just pretended to become liberals and progressives, and while as the party became overwhelmingly liberal and progressive, right? That's why you had Senator not Larry Bird, wow. Senator, I think Robert Byrd, he was a Klansman, and he's a Democrat. All right? So just really think about this shit. Now, more than 4 decades later, that vocal advocacy clouds the early stages of Mr. Biden's 2020 presidential run. In 2 weeks since Senator Kamala Harris of California, the rival for the nomination, and now his goddamn VP pick, right, invoked her own story of being bused to school, forcefully challenged Mr. Biden during the first Democratic presidential debates, and on the heels of criticism of his work with segregationist on crime legislation. So this is a perfect article because it was written when they both was vying for the presidential spot, and they was they was going at each other during the debates. Not only did she bring up his sexual abuse allegations, but she also was basically calling him a racist because he was against it. She was the one that brought it up, all right? Brought up both her fake ass busting story probably because she's trying to associate herself with being black. So that story was, I'm gonna look more into this because I'm gonna try to find any mention of this before she even ran for president. And, you know, see if it's in a Senate run, because in her Senate run, that's when she's starting to build up her presidential candidacy and starting to pretend to be black. But before then, when she was DA and stuff like that, I want to hear some kind of story during that time of her busting, because I believe that story is bullshit. But it's for the sake of time, she did bring that up, and she brought it up to, like, you know, prove that he's a racist and why you should vote for her and not him. And like as she's pretending to be for black people. Excuse me. Mr. Biden's standing has dropped among the Democratic electorate, and his status as the racist early frontrunner is freshly threatened as his polling leads among black voters softens.
Yes, and by the way, what you all know, but most people don't know, unlike the African American community, with notable exceptions, the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community with incredibly different attitudes about different things. You go to Florida, you find a very different attitude about immigration in certain places than you do when you're in Arizona. So it's a very diverse community.
So we got one last article. This is only about a page or two. I only cut the important paragraphs out of here. Joe Biden worried in 1977 that certain desegregation policies would cause his children to grow up in a racist jungle. This is from Business Insider. And this also was from, from July 15th, all right, 2019. This is from around when, I guess, the debates and stuff was going on, right? So here's Joe Biden in 72. He's about 29, 30 years old right there. says former Vice President Joe Biden is facing increased scrutiny over his record on busing and racial issues. And this week, old comments resurfaced in which he said in 1977 that non-orderly racial integration policies would cause his children to grow up in a racial jungle. Now that's a fucked up comment. I guess the jungle part is because in Delaware, especially, there was a lot of black people here. So if his kids go to school with us, it's a racial jungle. And it's the same guy who considers himself, who told you that if you can't figure out to vote for me, that you're not black. But you know, when some of y'all parents was going to school, you know what I'm saying? And for some of the older listeners, when you was going to school, it was a racial jungle to him, and didn't want his kids to go to school with you. The quote was originally discovered by University of Southern California law professor and scholar Daria Rotmeyer, and first reported by the New York Times, which published a lengthy story on Biden's record on busing and school desegregation on Monday morning, and we just read that article. So this is crazy. Now black people are caping for him. Now he's caping for a Hindu who's pretending to be black. I mean, the Democrat Party are just like the biggest pieces of shit in the fucking world. So you think about that next time they want you to vote for them.
I get overwhelming support from the black leadership, young and old. Every poll shows me way ahead.
And black people saved your political life in the primaries this year. They have things they want from you. And one of them is a black woman running mate. What do you say to them?
What I say to them is that I'm not acknowledging anybody who is being considered, but I guarantee you there are multiple black women being considered.
Seeing the last the records of Joe Biden, especially on the crime bill, which was targeted blacks, we see his staunch opposition of desegregation of schools, which includes busing. It's the same thing. Busing is kind of not a slang term, but just another term used for desegregation, because they used to put black kids on who used to go walk and go to the neighborhood schools in their neighborhood, put on buses that took them farther out to white districts or white schools to integrate them, desegregate them. Even though I grew up in New York City, my mother, who also grew up in New York City, grew up in Queens, the borough of Queens actually. She was actually bused in the 1960s, right after the I think not Brown, because that was in the 1950s, but right after New York City was basically forced, or the Queens was like the last place where they where schools were pretty much segregated. My mom grew up in she basically grew up in Hollis, same neighborhood LL Cool J is from, and I still have family cousins out there and stuff. LL Cool J and Run DMC, all of them, they all grew up right around the corner from my family out there off of Linden Boulevard, and that's basically it's almost like a suburb of Jamaica, Queens, which is a little more run down, whereas Hollis is a little more middle class, but it's black. It's overwhelmingly black in that part of Queens, central and southern Queens. So she was picked to be bused all the way up to Whitestone, which is like on the far north end of Queens, and it was a white neighborhood, and it was extremely racist there. My mom used to get spit on by grown men and grown women, and who would knock books out of her hand and stuff like that. She walked to the stores during her breaks and stuff, during her like lunch break or whatever, to the point where she was just sick of it. And it's just crazy. So I've experienced through my mom, and I've heard the stories and stuff, and it's just horrifying that grown people would do this. And they really did not want their kids going to school with us, with black kids and stuff, and to the point where they would assault black kids. All right, these people are sick, sickening. So Biden was on the side of these people and sticking up for them. So when I see this, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump and you ain't black, well, I never heard Trump, ever make statements that he was against desegregation. Some people tout the Central Park 5 thing, and I'm gonna do a video called Trump derangement syndrome, which I believe like 99% of blacks have. I'm just saying, if I had to pick the lesser of two evils here, I can't say it's Joe Biden. I really can't. Joe Biden had 50 years in the Senate to make changes, and and today he's still making racist comments, and it makes more sense when you look into his record and his comments of how he's comfortable with saying shit like this, because it's all an act, and he thinks you're stupid. That's why he didn't want his kids going to school with us. Also, real quick, and I'm not reading no articles, I just want to point these out. How Nancy Pelosi forgot George Floyd's name while Law and Police Reform Bill inspired by his death, and calls him George Kirby instead. Now, I don't know who George Kirby is. Obviously, that's before my time. Nancy Pelosi is as old as fucking Moses' farts. So, who knows how long ago that is. The picture's in black and white, so it's old. Look, I can go into the whole BLM shit, and I will, because my next video probably will be on that. But wow, you're so for BLM to the point where you're praising the protesters and all this other crap because they want the chaos and shit. But then you make a bill that's supposed to be inspired by this guy George Floyd, and you just couldn't even. You're so fucking pompous that in your own world, and so fucking retarded and ditzy and goddamn. I think the bitch is like on drugs and fucking drinking. When she comes out there and shit, she couldn't even remember the dude's name. I mean, you probably wrote in speech. No, she didn't write no speech. Man, I can't stand this bitch. And don't forget that this is the woman that's holding up your stimulus checks. Okay, she held up the stimulus checks because the Republicans didn't want to pay for anything other than just giving out the money to the people, and the Democrats like her wanted more a raise. You should look into what they tack on what you would call pork, which is like unnecessary shit into these bills, and like $billions of dollars for the post office. Like, when's the last time you ever mailed off a letter? But we do know they want to use the post office or the mail-in ballots, right? Even though I can go to the grocery store and it's crowded, I can go to work. If you work at a essential factory, like I say, an Amazon factory with 2,000 people in there, but they're gonna tell you can't go into a school and drop off a ballot. But that's besides the point. We'll get to that in another video. But these are the people that y'all voting for. She couldn't even remember the dude's name. Okay, so just remember that.